The soldiers of the Ashvale clan told a story about their commander that had grown so large it had become something closer to myth than fact. They said Commander Ygritte Morkant did not sleep. They said she stood watch over the camp every night of every campaign, prowling the perimeter long after the fires burned to embers, her silhouette visible against the tree line at all hours, her single working eye, the other clouded pale by an old scar that ran from brow to jaw. Always open, always searching the dark for threats that the rest of them were too tired to see. They called her the Iron Wolf, and they said it the way you might speak of weather or gravity, or any other force too large and too certain to argue with. It was, of course, not true. Not the way they told it. Ygritte did sleep. She simply did not sleep well, and had not for 11 years, and had built an entire second self out of the discipline required to hide that fact from 8,000 soldiers who needed to believe their commander was something more than a woman who flinched from her own dreams. She was tall even among orcs, broad through the shoulder in a way that made doorways narrow and mattresses too short, her skin a bright, uncompromising green that had gone leathery and cross-hatched with scars across 3 decades of campaigns. Her tusks, once matched and proud, were both broken, the left near the root, the right at a jagged angle that made her snarl look crueler than she intended, which she had long ago decided was useful rather than unfortunate. She kept her black hair cropped close to the skull, out of habit and practicality, and she wore her armor the way other women wore their own skin, as though she had never once existed without it. She had built the Iron Wolf out of necessity, the way you build a wall out of necessity, stone by stone, because the alternative is that everything behind it gets in. What was behind it was this. Every night, without exception, when Ygritte closed her eyes, she was standing again in the burning ruin of Caldrith Hollow, ash falling like grey snow, and she was listening to the voices of the 41 soldiers under her command who had not made it out. She heard them by name. She heard Bran Usgar calling for his sister. She heard the twins, Kova and Kesh, calling for each other, and then, worse, not calling anymore. She heard, always last and always loudest, the voice of Dara Sinit, the 17-year-old scout Ygritte had personally recruited from a farming village 3 months earlier and personally failed to pull free from the collapsed granary before the fire reached her. Ygritte had been given command of that company because she was the best tactician in 3 provinces. She had lost that company because the intelligence she'd been given was wrong, the retreat route had been cut off by a force nobody had warned her about, and there had not been enough time, not enough hands, not enough of anything except fire and screaming in her own body, which could carry exactly 2 soldiers at once, and not a single one more. She had carried 2. She thought, some nights, that the 2 she'd carried resented her for it. That surviving a slaughter your commander could not prevent was its own kind of curse, and that they, too, heard the voices of the ones who hadn't made it, and that they, too, understood that Ygritte had chosen them, in the end, essentially at random, because there had been no time to choose well. She had not lost a battle since. She had also not slept more than 2 consecutive hours since, not once, not in 11 years, and she had disguised the difference as discipline for so long that even she sometimes believed her own performance. Tonight was no different. She lay on the narrow cot in her command tent with her eyes open, listening to the wind move through the canvas, and did the arithmetic she always did before permitting herself to close her eyes. If she slept for even 20 minutes, the dream would come, and the dream would wake her sweating and silent. She had trained herself, over years, never to make a sound, and then she would rise, dress, and walk the perimeter until dawn, and no one would ever know that the Iron Wolf's tireless vigilance was simply a woman too afraid to lie still. She closed her eyes anyway, because the body has its own demands regardless of what the mind has decided to fear, and the dream came, as it always did, exactly the way it always came. She was standing in the ash. Dara was calling her name. 3 days later, in a skirmish along the Red Dun Pass that should never have happened, a human raiding party had struck the supply column Ygritte was escorting, and she had thrown herself into the gap between the wagons and the enemy line without waiting to see whether her soldiers had followed, because that was simply what she did, A spear caught her along the ribs, under the arm, and the one seam her armor didn't fully cover. She did not fall. She finished the fight, dragged 2 wounded soldiers behind the wagon line herself, and only permitted herself to acknowledge the wound once the skirmish was won and the last of the raiders had fled into the hills. By then she had lost enough blood that the world had gone soft and gray at the edges, and her lieutenant, a broad-shouldered young orc named Tarik, half carried her into the medical tent shouting for the healer. The healer who answered was not who Tarik expected. Hollis Reed had been a prisoner of the Ashvale clan for 4 months. He had been a field surgeon attached to a human border garrison that Egret's forces had overrun in the spring, and where most captured humans were held for ransom or put to labor. Hollis had made himself useful almost immediately. He did not care whose wounds he treated, orc or human, so long as the wounds needed treating, and after he'd saved the life of a young orc soldier that the clan's own healers had given up on, the clan's aging chief healer, Old Vesa, had simply started handing him patients. He was, by now, less a prisoner than an inconvenient fixture, watched, restricted, unransomed, but permitted, within the medical tent, an authority that extended even over commanders. He was younger than Egret by perhaps a decade, human, of middling height, with sandy hair perpetually falling into pale eyes and hands that moved with a steadiness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with certainty. He had a scholar's slightness of build and a soldier's calm under pressure, and he had, in 4 months of captivity, developed absolutely no capacity for being intimidated by orcs, commanders included. "Set her down," he said before Tarik had finished the sentence announcing who she was. "There on the table, not the cot. I need the light." Tarik, who had personally watched Egret break a man's jaw for speaking to her in that tone, set her down without argument. Egret, drifting somewhere just this side of consciousness, was aware of hands at her side, cutting away leather and cloth with brisk efficiency, and a voice, steady, unhurried, entirely unbothered by whose blood it was, narrating what it found as though she were any other patient, and not the most feared woman in 4 kingdoms. "Deep, but it missed a lung by a hand's width," the voice said. "You're very lucky, Commander, or very good at getting hit in places that don't kill you. I suspect the latter, given the scars." Her eye, the working one, opened enough to find him. "Who?" she managed. "In the depths are you?" "Hollis Reed. I'm going to stitch you now. It will hurt considerably less if you stop trying to sit up." She had not, in fact, been trying to sit up on purpose. Her body had simply attempted it, out of some deep animal instinct that objected to lying still and vulnerable in front of a stranger. She forced herself down onto the table by sheer will, glaring at him with the eye that still worked, and he glanced up at her glare with an expression of mild, professional unconcern, as though commanders glared at him hourly, and he had long ago stopped finding it interesting. "That's a good instinct in a battle," he said, threading a needle. "It's a bad instinct on my table. Hold still, please. You do not tell me to hold still." "I am telling you exactly that, because if you move, I will put a stitch through muscle that should be under muscle, and you will have a worse scar and a longer recovery, and you will still have to lie here while I fix my own mistake. So, hold still." She held still. She would think about that later. That she had held still for him, immediately, out of some instinct that had nothing to do with obedience, and everything to do with recognizing, somewhere below conscious thought, that this small unafraid human knew precisely what he was doing and that she did not. He worked in silence for a while, and she watched him work, because it gave her something to do besides feel the pain, which was considerable, and which she had also long ago trained herself not to show. His hands were steady. His breathing was even. He did not once look up to check whether his patient was frightening him, because it apparently had not occurred to him that she might be. "There," he said finally, tying off the last stitch and sitting back. 22 stitches, 1 cracked rib that I bound as best I can, and you are going to lie on that cot," he pointed, "for at least 4 days, or you're going to tear this open again and we'll be back where we started, except with less blood in you to spare." I have a company to command. Your company, Hollis said, wiping his hands on a cloth, will survive 4 days without you standing over it. You, apparently, have survived considerably worse than 4 days of rest, given the state of you, and I would like to keep it that way, professional pride being what it is. He looked at her properly for the first time since she'd been carried in. Not at the wound, not at the blood, but at her face, at the scar and the broken tusks and the eye that had gone the color of old ice. You're an exceptionally difficult patient, Commander. I can already tell. Aigret, who had not been spoken to without fear in longer than she could remember, found she did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, and let him help her onto the cot, and told herself the strange loosening in her chest was simply the blood loss. She did not intend to sleep. She intended to lie on the cot until her body had recovered enough strength to overrule Hollis Reed's instructions, which she estimated at perhaps 6 hours, and then she intended to return to her duties regardless of what any human medic thought about it. But blood loss and exhaustion are a heavier combination than pride can usually outlast, and somewhere in the deep hours of the night, in the medical tent instead of her own, surrounded by the low sounds of other wounded soldiers breathing, Aigret slept. The dream came, as it always did. She was in the ash again. Caldrith Hollow burned around her, the granary collapsing in slow, terrible silence, and Dara's voice rose up through the smoke, calling her name, and Aigret ran toward it the way she always ran toward it, knowing, the way you know things in dreams, that she would not reach her in time, that she had never once reached her in time in 11 years of trying. A hand closed around hers. It was not part of the dream. She knew that, somewhere below the panic, in the same animal part of her mind that had gone still on Hollis's table, this was a hand from outside the fire, warm and real and entirely unlike the smoke-thinned ghosts of her nightmare, and it held on with a steadiness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with certainty, the same quality she noticed in his stitches. Her breathing, which had been ragged and fast, slowed. The fire receded. Dara's voice grew distant, then quiet, then gone, and Aigret slept, actually slept, deep and dreamless and unbroken, for the first time in 11 years, until gray morning light came through the tent flap and she woke to find Hollis Reed sitting on a low stool beside her cot, her enormous scarred hand still folded inside both of his head tipped forward in the doze of a man who had clearly not intended to fall asleep himself. He woke when she stirred. He did not let go of her hand immediately. He seemed, for a moment, to have forgotten he was holding it, and then he blinked, realized, and released her with the brisk, unbothered efficiency of a man returning a borrowed tool. You were having a nightmare, he said by way of explanation. Loudly for you, which is to say, not loudly at all, but I've treated enough soldiers to recognize the signs. I took your hand to try to settle you before you woke the rest of the tent. It seemed to work. Aigret sat up too fast, ignoring the pull of stitches, and fixed him with a look designed to end the conversation permanently. It was a coincidence. Perhaps, Hollis said, entirely unconvinced and entirely unbothered by being unconvinced. How do you feel? Rested, she thought, and the thought terrified her more than the dream had. Fine, she said. I am leaving. You are not, Hollis said, checking her bandages with the same brisk hands as the night before. 4 days, Commander. You've had one. She left anyway, 3 hours later, overruling him with the sheer immovable force of command that had never once failed her against soldiers 3 times his size, and Hollis let her go with nothing more than a raised eyebrow and a comment about difficult patience that she pretended not to hear. That night, in her own tent, alone, the dream came back exactly on schedule, and it did not stop until she woke herself, shaking and silent, at the 4th hour of the night, and lay awake until dawn doing the arithmetic she had done for 11 years, better to be tired than to be seen. She told herself it proved nothing. She told herself this for 2 more nights, both of which went the same way, before she gave up telling herself anything at all and walked back to the medical tent on the 4th evening with her ribs still aching and her pride considerably more wounded than her side. Hollis looked up from the ledger he was updating and did not look surprised to see her. Couldn't sleep, Commander? I am here to have my stitches checked, Ygritte said, with what dignity she had remaining. Of course you are, Hollis said, and pulled out the stool. She did not order him never to tell anyone until the 6th night, once it had become undeniable, even to her, even to the part of her that had spent 11 years being certain that nothing and no one could touch the thing that lived behind the ash, that his hand in hers was not a coincidence, was not a fluke of blood loss and exhaustion, was the only thing in over a decade that had made the nightmare stop. If you tell a soul, she said, low and dangerous, in the particular voice she used on soldiers who had failed her, I will personally see to it that. Commander, Hollis interrupted, entirely unafraid, which was, she was coming to realize, simply how he spoke to everyone. I am a captured field surgeon currently under armed guard in an enemy camp. Who, precisely, do you imagine I am going to tell? The chief healer, who already suspects and has said nothing? Your lieutenant, who brought you to me bleeding and will presumably notice regardless of what either of us says. He considered her for a moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly, in a way that made her chest do something complicated. I won't tell anyone, Ygritte. Not because you ordered me not to. Because it isn't mine to tell. It was the first time he had used her name without the title in front of it. She noticed. She did not comment on it, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging how much she noticed, but she noticed, and something in her, some old and tired and long-guarded thing, loosened another fraction of an inch. I will allow you to continue, she said, as though granting a great concession. Under the condition of absolute secrecy. Understood, Hollis said, entirely too pleased with himself for a man agreeing to terms dictated to him by a warlord. Give me your hand then, Commander. Discipline requires structure. And so their secret routine began. Each night, once the camp had settled and the fires had burned to embers, Ygritte would find some reason to visit the medical tent, a wound to have checked, a report to deliver, once, memorably, a complaint about the quality of the bandages that both of them knew was invented on the spot. And Hollis would pull the stool beside her cot, and take her hand in one of his while he read medical notes or camp reports with the other, and Ygritte would pretend, with as much dignity as she could summon, that she merely tolerated the arrangement. She did not merely tolerate it. She began, within a fortnight, to notice the particular quality of the light in the medical tent at dusk, the smell of dried herbs and clean linen, the specific, unhurried rhythm of his breathing when he read. She began, though she would never have admitted it aloud, to watch the entrance of her own command tent in the late afternoons, waiting, impatiently, though she called it something else, for the moment when duties would permit her to make her way to the medical tent under whatever thin pretext she'd invented that day. Hollis, for his part, never asked her to explain herself. He never made her name the thing that was happening between them, never demanded she acknowledge, out loud, that the Iron Wolf sought out a captured human medic's hand every night because it was the only thing that let her sleep. He simply held out his hand when she arrived, and let her take it in her own time, and read his notes, and asked her small, undemanding questions about her day that she found herself, against every instinct of 11 years, actually answering. It was in one of these quiet exchanges, perhaps 3 weeks into their arrangement, that he asked her about the scars. Not the visible ones, the ones any soldier could see, but the invisible kind, the kind that made a woman lie awake for 11 years rather than close her eyes. Ygritte did not answer at first. Then, in the low light, with her hand in his and no one to see her admit weakness, she told him about Caldrith Hollow. She told it flatly, the way she told all difficult things, stripped of feeling because feeling was a luxury a commander could not afford in front of her soldiers. The bad intelligence. The cut-off retreat route. The 41 names she still knew by heart, in order, the way she'd learned them when she'd first taken command of that company. Bren Usgar, the twins Kova and Kesh, and last, worst, always last, Dara Sinit, 17 years old, 3 months in service, calling for a commander who could not reach her in time. I carry 2, she said when she'd finished. 2 soldiers out of the granary, before the roof came down. I chose them. I did not choose to. There was no time to choose well, there was only time to grab whoever was closest and run. But I chose them, and 39 others were not close enough, and I have spent 11 years hearing their voices every single night because closing my eyes is the only time I am not disciplined enough to keep them out. Hollis did not offer her comfort in the way she'd expected. No soft assurances that it wasn't her fault, no attempt to argue her out of a guilt that had been load-bearing in her architecture for over a decade. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his thumb moving slowly over the back of her scarred hand, and then he said, "Tell me their names." "What?" "The 41. Tell me their names. Not tonight, necessarily, but sometime. I would like to know them. Not as a list of your failures, Commander. As people who existed, and mattered, and were led by someone who has apparently spent 11 years making certain their families never went hungry, based on what your lieutenant let slip when he thought I wasn't listening." Ygritte went very still. "He should not have told you that. He's proud of you," Hollis said simply. "It's not a secret to anyone but you, apparently, that Commander Morgan sends half her pay to the families of soldiers she's lost, under 3 different false names, so that none of them will know it's charity and refuse it. It's not a secret that you remember every name. You act as though carrying that weight is a punishment you deserve, Ygritte, but from where I sit, it looks like the opposite. It looks like love. A very stubborn, very orc kind of love, but love regardless." Ygritte turned her face away, because something was happening in her chest that she did not have a name for and did not trust herself to control, and Hollis, with the same steady, unhurried patience he brought to every wound he'd ever stitched, simply held her hand and let her have the silence until she was ready to speak again. It was, she thought later, the first time in 11 years that someone had looked directly at the thing she carried and called it something other than weakness. She learned, in turn, that Hollis Reed was not the fragile thing his slight build and gentle manner suggested to anyone who hadn't watched him work. She learned it first from old Vesa, the chief healer, who mentioned in passing, with the particular pride of a teacher discussing a student who had exceeded expectations, that Hollis had crossed the no-man's land between the Ashvale lines and the human garrison 3 separate times during the siege that had ended in his capture, unarmed, under a healer's flag that half the archers on both sides had been perfectly willing to ignore, to drag wounded men off the field regardless of which uniform they wore. She learned it again, more directly, when a fever swept through the camp's prisoner stockade and Hollis spent 4 days and 3 sleepless nights moving between cots, orc and human alike, refusing every order from the camp's quartermaster to prioritize Ashvale soldiers over the human captives, informing the man with quiet, immovable calm that he had taken an oath long before he'd taken a spear wound to the shoulder that had never fully healed, and that the oath did not have an asterisk for convenience. They threatened to execute him for it, Tarek told her, later, not knowing, or perhaps knowing precisely, what the information would do to her. Chief Garrow wanted him made an example of. Old Vesa talked him down. Said no healer in 3 kingdoms was worth losing over a point of pride. Ygritte thought of Hollis's steady hands on her ribs, the calm, unbothered way he told her to hold still, the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd asked her to tell him the names of the dead. She had assumed, without ever quite examining the assumption, that his gentleness and his fearlessness existed in spite of each other, that a man so unafraid to speak plainly to a warlord must simply be too naive to understand danger. She understood, now, that she had been wrong. His courage was not the loud, physical kind she'd built her own reputation on. It was quieter. It asked for no audience, no legend, no title like the Iron Wolf to protect it from scrutiny. It simply did what it believed was right, every time, regardless of the cost, and never once mentioned the cost to anyone. It was, she thought, watching him that evening from across the medical tent as he rebandaged a young orc soldier's burned hand with the same unhurried care he gave every patient, no less powerful than her own. It might, in fact, have been considerably braver. It was Tarek who found them, 6 weeks into their arrangement, on a morning when he entered the medical tent early to report a border skirmish, and stopped dead in the entrance. Commander Egret Morkant, the Iron Wolf, the woman who had never lost a battle and never, in the memory of any soldier currently serving under her, been seen to sleep, lay asleep on the medical cot with her cheek resting against Hollis Reed's shoulder, her enormous scarred hand wrapped tightly around his, their fingers laced together in the unmistakable, unguarded intimacy of two people who trusted each other completely. Hollis was asleep as well, upright on his stool, his head tipped against hers, a half-finished medical ledger still open on his knee. Tariq stood in the entrance for a long moment. He had served under Egret for 9 years. He had watched her carry 2 soldiers out of a burning granary with her own back on fire. He had watched her stand at the head of the army for 11 years, expressionless, immovable, apparently untouched by anything that would have broken a lesser soldier, and had privately worried, more than once, about what that kind of untouchable calm eventually cost a person. He looked, now, at his commander's face, slack with real, unguarded sleep, none of the careful discipline she wore during every waking hour, nothing but simple peace. And understood, all at once, exactly what it had cost her, and exactly what this small, unafraid, unransomed human medic had apparently given back. He did not wake them. He did not tell a soul. He backed out of the tent as quietly as a man his size was capable of, and personally posted 2 additional guards outside the medical tent's entrance with strict instructions that no one was to disturb the commander's rest, and when Egret asked him 3 days later, with dangerous casualness, whether he had noticed anything unusual on his early visit, Tariq met her eye without flinching and said, "No, Commander. Nothing at all." She studied him for a long moment. Something in his expression, not fear, not pity, something closer to quiet loyalty, told her he was lying, and told her, also, that the lie would hold, for as long as she needed it to. "Good," she said, and let the matter drop, and did not examine too closely why the loosening in her chest, when she understood that her secret was safe with someone who loved her enough to protect it without being asked, felt very much like relief. The order came 8 weeks after Egret's injury, carried by a rider from the clan's high command, and it was the kind of order that could not be refused without consequences that reached far beyond one commander's career. The Ashvale clan was to move against Fortress Kelwyn, a heavily garrisoned human stronghold along the eastern border, in a coordinated assault timed to coincide with a larger offensive along the whole of the frontier. Egret's company, as the clan's most decorated, was to lead the initial breach. Egret read the order twice before she understood, with a cold, sinking clarity, exactly what it meant. Fortress Kelwyn was where Hollis's younger sister, Wren, served as a healer. A fact Egret knew only because Hollis had mentioned it once, quietly, on a night when the conversation had drifted toward home and family and all the things prisoners of war rarely spoke of aloud. Wren was 19. She had followed her older brother into the healing trade, and the 2 of them wrote letters that Hollis had not received in 4 months, and worried about, in the specific unspoken way of a person who loves someone they cannot protect. Egret was being ordered to lead an assault on the fortress where the person Hollis loved most in the world was stationed. She could not refuse the order without being branded a traitor to her clan. 11 years of unbroken victories would not save her from that particular accusation, not when the order came from high command and not when refusal, for a commander of her rank, would be read by every soldier under her as evidence that the human prisoner in her medical tent had compromised her loyalty. And Hollis, steady, principled, quietly unbending Hollis, could never, she knew without asking, help her plan an assault that might kill his own sister. To ask it of him would be to ask him to become someone he was not, and she would not do that to him, not even to save herself from what came next. She went to the medical tent that evening with the order folded in her fist, and did not take his hand. "I received new orders," she said, and told him, flatly, without softening any part of it, exactly what they were. She watched something break open behind his pale eyes. Not anger, not accusation, something worse, something like grief arriving early, in anticipation of a loss that had not yet happened, and she understood, watching it, that she had two choices, and both of them cost her something she did not know how to survive losing. "I am sending you back to the prisoner stockade," she said, before he could speak, before either of them could say anything that would make this harder than it already was. "Effective tonight. I will lead this assault alone. You will not be involved in any part of its planning, and you will not be asked to choose between your sister and—" She stopped, because she did not have a word for what they were to each other that felt safe to say aloud, not now, not with the order still crushed in her fist. "Between your sister and me. Ygritte. This is not a negotiation, Hollis." Her voice had gone hard, the voice of the Iron Wolf, the voice she used on soldiers, because it was the only voice she trusted herself to keep steady. "I have let myself become weak. I let a prisoner hold my hand every night until I forgot what I am and what you are, and now I have been handed proof of exactly why that was a mistake. I am a commander of the Ashvale clan. You are a captured medic from the nation I am about to attack." There was never going to be a version of this that ended anywhere but here. She left before he could answer, because she did not trust her voice to hold if he did, and she spent that night, and every night for the following week, alone in her own tent, awake, listening to the fire crackle and the ash fall in a dream she had no hand to hold back. Hollis did not accept the assignment to the stockade quietly, though he made certain Ygritte never learned how loudly he'd objected, arguing his case first to old Vesa and then, when that failed, to Tarik, either of whom had the authority to overturn a commander's direct order. What he found, instead, in the week that followed, was something that changed the shape of the entire conflict. It began with a discrepancy in the supply requisitions he'd been permitted to review as part of his medical duties, a pattern of missing grain shipments that should have reached both the Ashvale camp and, according to letters smuggled to him by a sympathetic quartermaster's clerk, Fortress Kelwyn itself, diverted instead to a private holding controlled by a human nobleman named Lord Ashcombe Vale, whose lands bordered the contested frontier on both the human and orc sides. It continued when Hollis, working through contacts among the prisoner population and carefully, through old Vesa's own network of trusted informants, uncovered evidence that the unprovoked raids attributed to both sides over the past 2 years, including, he realized with cold horror, the raid on the supply column that had led to Ygritte's own injury, had in fact been orchestrated by Vale's mercenaries, disguised as regular soldiers of whichever side would most benefit politically from the appearance of an unprovoked attack. Lord Vale, it became clear, had spent 2 years manufacturing a war between the Ashvale clan and the human border kingdoms, profiting enormously from both sides' military contracts while the actual cost, in soldiers, in supplies, in every name Ygritte carried on the list she'd never stopped keeping, was paid entirely by people who had no idea they were fighting a war invented for someone else's fortune. Hollis spent 4 sleepless days assembling the proof, intercepted correspondence, falsified requisition orders, the testimony of 2 of Vale's own former mercenaries who Hollis, with characteristic steadiness, had convinced to speak rather than hang for their part in it. And on the 5th day, with the Ashvale assault on Fortress Kelwyn scheduled for dawn, he did the only thing he could think of that might stop it in time. He went to find Ygritte. The Ashvale army stood assembled at the edge of the frontier at first light, 8,000 soldiers arrayed in formation, waiting on their commander's word to advance on Fortress Kelwyn. Ygritte stood at the front of the line, her armor fastened, her expression carved from the same iron her soldiers had named her for, and if any of them noticed that she had not slept, that the shadows beneath her eyes had grown darker with every night of the past week, that her hands, when she gave her orders, were steadier than they had any right to be given how little rest lay behind them, none of them said so. Because that was not a thing you said to the Iron Wolf. She raised her hand to give the order to advance. That was when Hollis Reed walked out of the tree line and directly toward the front of the assembled army, unarmed, under no flag but his own steady certainty, carrying a satchel of documents that he held above his head as he walked, calling out, in a voice that carried further than his slight frame should have permitted, that the war they were about to fight had been manufactured, that the proof was in his hands. That Commander Morkant's own injury. The injury half the soldiers present had watched her survive, had been engineered by the same nobleman who now stood to profit from every death the coming battle would cause. 8,000 soldiers turned to look at him. Then they turned to look at their commander, to see what the Iron Wolf would do with an unransomed prisoner interrupting a battle order with wild accusations. Ygritte looked at Hollis. Steady, unafraid, walking toward her army with nothing but the truth in his hands because it was, she understood in that moment, simply what he did, over and over, regardless of the cost to himself, and she felt the exhaustion of the past week, the sleepless nights, the ash and the fire, and the 11 years of carrying everything alone, rise up all at once behind her eyes. She lowered her hand before it could give the order to advance. "Let him speak," she said, and her voice, for the first time in front of her assembled army, was not entirely steady. Hollis reached her, breathing hard from the walk, and did not hesitate, did not perform caution for the sake of the watching soldiers. He held out his hand. Ygritte Morkant, commander of the Ashvale clan, the Iron Wolf, the woman who had never once, in 11 years, allowed herself to be seen as anything but untouchable, took the hand of a human medic in front of 8,000 of her own soldiers, without shame, without hesitation, and held on. What followed took the better part of a day. Hollis's evidence, once laid before Ygritte's council, and eventually, a hastily arranged parley with the commander of Fortress Kelwyn's garrison, proved impossible to dismiss. The forged requisitions, the diverted grain, the testimony of Vale's own mercenaries, and most damning of all, a ledger detailing 2 years of payments from Vale's private accounts to soldiers on both sides of the conflict for services rendered under false banners. The garrison commander at Kelwyn, a weathered human officer named General Bethera Cole, who had lost a brother in one of Vale's manufactured raids, listened to the evidence with a stillness that Ygritte recognized, because she wore the same stillness herself, the particular quiet of a soldier realizing that grief she'd carried for years had been manufactured by someone else's greed. "If this is true," Cole said finally, "then Lord Vale has cost my kingdom 400 soldiers and cost your clan, by my count, considerably more, and he has done it from the comfort of an estate neither of our armies has ever once threatened." "It's true," Ygritte said. "I trust a man who found it more than I trust anyone alive." Something in the way she said it, steady, absolute, entirely without her usual guardedness, made General Cole glance at Hollis, and then at the hand Ygritte had not released since he'd walked out of the tree line, and the general, who had clearly seen a great many strange things in a long career, simply nodded, as though this, too, was simply one more strange and understandable thing about war. Lord Vale was arrested within the week, his estate seized, his mercenary network dismantled by the joint effort of 2 armies that had, until 5 days earlier, been prepared to slaughter each other on his behalf. The assault on Fortress Kelwyn was called off. Peace negotiations, tentative and fragile but real, began within the month, and Wren Reed, Hollis's sister, wrote her brother the first letter he had received in 5 months, 3 lines long, which he read 7 times before he could bring himself to put it down. The war that had cost Ygritte 11 years of nightmares and 41 names she would never stop carrying had never needed to happen at all. Peace, once it arrived with a great deal of paperwork, and it was nearly a month before the medical tent that had been Hollis and Ygritte's private world for 3 months was finally due to be struck, the camp disbanding, soldiers on both sides returning to homes some of them had not seen in years. Hollis, as a released prisoner under the new peace accord, was free to return to human lands. He had, in fact, already been offered a position at a hospital near the capital, a substantial one, the kind of position a field surgeon spent a career hoping for. Ygritte had said nothing about it. She had told herself, for a month, that she would not ask him to stay, because asking would mean admitting how much she needed him to, and the Iron Wolf did not admit to needing anything, not even now, not even after everything. On their last night in the field hospital, the cots already half dismantled, the medical supplies packed for transport, only Hollis's stool and Egret's cot left standing amid the wreckage of a tent that had held 11 years of nightmares and 3 months of something entirely different. Egret sat with her hand in his, and found, for the first time since Caldwell Hollow, that she did not know how to hold the fear she was feeling behind a wall of discipline. "You have a position waiting for you," she said, staring at the tent's canvas ceiling rather than at him. "In the capital. A good one. The kind you have earned 10 times over." "I do," Hollis agreed. "I do not know," Egret said, and her voice, when it finally admitted the things she had spent a month failing to say, was smaller than any voice her soldiers had ever heard her use. "Whether I can sleep, Hollis. Without this. Without you. I have spent 11 years teaching myself that I do not need anyone, and I do not know how to unlearn 11 years in a single night, and I do not know what I am asking you for, except that I am asking, which I have never once done for anyone in my life, and I find that I am." She stopped, because the word was too large, too dangerous, too much like admitting the wall had come all the way down. "Afraid," Hollis finished for her, gently, and she let him, because it was, finally, simply true. Hollis did not answer with words at first. He rose from the stool where he had sat every night for 3 months, and climbed onto the narrow cot beside her, the cot too small for a woman her size, made smaller now by 2 people who had no intention of letting that stop them, and placed his hand in hers, the way he had every night since the first, and settled his head against her shoulder as though there were nowhere else in either kingdom he would rather be. "Then it's fortunate," he told her, "that I wasn't planning to leave." Egret went very still, the way she had gone still the first night his hand had found hers in the dark, and something that had been braced for 11 years, braced against loss, against grief, against the particular danger of loving anyone enough that losing them might break her, finally, quietly, let go. "You would give up the capital," she said. "The hospital. Your home. For a war camp and a woman who cannot sleep without holding your hand." "I would give up considerably more than that," Hollis said, "for a woman who has spent 11 years keeping an entire army safe at the cost of her own peace, and who is, against every instinct I possess as a physician, the single most stubborn patient I have ever treated, and who I love, Egret, entirely, without reservation, and without the smallest intention of ever letting go of this hand again unless you asked me to." "I will never ask you to," Egret said, and meant it more completely than she had meant anything in 11 years. She slept that night, and every night after, without the ash, without the fire, without Dara's voice calling from beneath the granary roof. She still carried the 41 names. She would carry them for the rest of her life, the way she had always known she would, because that was simply what love asked of a commander who had lost people she could not save. But she no longer carried them alone in the dark, and the weight, held in 2 hands instead of 1, had finally, after 11 long years, become bearable. Years later, when new recruits joined the Asheville clan and heard the old stories about their commander, they still whispered that Egret Morkan never slept, that she stood watch over her army through every night of every campaign, tireless, unbreakable, the iron wolf who had never lost a battle and never once shown fear. It was not, by then, entirely a lie. Commander Morkan had, in fact, ended the last true war of her generation, alongside a human medic who had walked into an army of 8,000 soldiers with nothing but the truth in his hands, and the peace they had won together had held, by then, for over a decade. Only those closest to her. Tarek, gray-haired now and still fiercely loyal, old Vessa's successor at the healing tents, the handful of soldiers who had served under her long enough to have earned her trust completely, knew the truth behind the legend. Every evening, without exception, the most feared warrior in the northern kingdoms returned to a modest house at the edge of the camp she still, even in peacetime, insisted on commanding, and there, in a bed considerably better suited to her size than a field hospital cot had ever been, Commander Egret Morkan fell asleep in perfect, unguarded peace, her enormous scarred hand wrapped around that of the gentle, unafraid, quietly courageous human medic she had, in the 3rd year of the peace, finally married, in a ceremony attended by soldiers from both sides of a war that had never needed to happen, all of whom agreed, privately, that they had never once seen their commander look so entirely, so completely, unafraid.